We all know that supervolcanoes are scary. They have the potential to wipe out life as we know it. But some of them have an even more immediate danger. Just ask anyone who lives near Yellowstone National Park. The rumbling beast beneath their feet isn't just a ticking time bomb for the whole world. It's also putting them at risk of sudden earthquakes. Yellowstone sits above a massive hotspot in Earth's mantle. This is where a plume of unusually hot rock rises up from deep in the planet, way deeper than the typical mantle plume. And instead of just punching through the crust and creating a volcano, this one has stayed roughly stationary for tens of millions of years. As the North American plate has moved over it, the stationary plume has literally melted the plate, causing magma to accumulate beneath Yellowstone. Magma chambers can often be found below volcanoes, but these chambers tend to be small, shallow pools of molten rock. Not so at Yellowstone. The magma chambers here extend more than 4 miles deep into the ground and may reach 20 miles wide. This means that when the magma chambers start to empty, they can trigger earthquakes hundreds of miles away from the actual volcano. We're talking about earthquakes that can shake cities like Salt Lake City and Los Angeles. But why would emptying magma chambers cause quakes in the first place? Why do magma chambers even exist? To understand how shaking your leg can trigger an earthquake halfway across the country, let's look at what happens when magma chambers form in the first place. It all starts with that mantle plume. Because it's hotter than the surrounding rock, it behaves kind of like a hot air balloon. Hot air rises because it's less dense than cold air, and hot rock does the same thing. But since the Earth's interior is mostly solid, this rising hot rock pushes and deforms the surrounding cooler rock instead of floating upwards. But that doesn't mean the rock just sits there. Instead, it slowly bends and shifts until it's moving at the same speed as the hot rock, which means it's now part of a convection current along with the hot rock. And if the hot rock is pushing up harder than the surrounding rock is resisting, this cycle of bending and shifting will eventually allow the hot rock to rise all the way to the surface. But this process takes thousands or even millions of years. And during that time, the cooler rock that was pushed aside by the hot rock just gets shoved further and further down. Eventually, it gets buried under so much rock that it becomes part of the lithosphere, the rigid outer part of the Earth's crust. In other words, it's part of the tectonic plates. So when the hot rock finally reaches the surface and forms a volcano, it brings that chunk of cooler rock with it. That's why many volcanoes aren't just cone-shaped piles of magma. They're actually made of alternating layers of magma and solid rock. This is happening at Yellowstone right now. But the weird thing about Yellowstone is that the magma isn't just coming up in one place. There are multiple plumes contributing to the supervolcano. And that means there are multiple points where rock is getting dragged down into the magma chambers. It's almost like having multiple fingers on a hot potato. If you hold too many hot potatoes at once, you're bound to drop one eventually. And in the case of Yellowstone, this dropping is happening in a big way. Think about a glass of water sitting on a diving board. When you bend the diving board, the water sloshes around, but overall the level stays pretty much the same. The water represents the pressure in the magma chamber, and if you keep bending the diving board, eventually the water splashes over the top. And this is what happens when the magma chamber empties suddenly. A large amount of magma makes its way up to the surface through vents and fissures, and huge earthquakes happen all around the region. In fact, the history of Yellowstone is full of earthquakes triggered by the collapse of magma chambers, and they've affected areas far beyond the park itself. In 1859, a massive earthquake with an estimated magnitude of 7.2 to 7.6 struck the region. Its epicenter was located about 40 miles southwest of West Yellowstone, and although no major cities were close enough to feel the effects, it was still the most powerful earthquake in recorded U.S. history at the time. It was only 50 years later that an even bigger quake hit in 1925. This one had an estimated magnitude between 7.3 and 7.7 and was felt as far away as Los Angeles. These distant rumblings are actually pretty common. From 1985 to 1986, a swarm of nearly 3,000 earthquakes shook the area around Yellowstone. Most were pretty small, but they reached as far away as New York City. And while quakes like these might not sound like a huge deal compared to the earthquakes that devastate places like Turkey and Syria, they're still dangerous. Their epicenters might be hundreds of miles away from cities, but they're strong enough to level buildings. Plus, they happen completely silently without any warning. And even if people living nearby are prepared for an earthquake, they're likely to be unprepared for what happens next. See, when the magma chamber empties, the land above it can collapse. Imagine if a sinkhole opened up under your house. That's what happened in 1985 when a series of earthquakes emptied a magma chamber. Thousands of acres of Yellowstone National Park suddenly dropped by as much as 16 feet. And that's not good news for anyone who happens to be standing nearby. Roads cracked, steam pipes burst and bridges crumbled. One unlucky tourist even got trapped in a mud flow and was carried 1,200 feet downhill before being rescued. What's worse, these sudden drops in the land can trigger another natural disaster, volcanic winter. You see, normally a supervolcano doesn't erupt in a single giant explosion. Instead, eruptions happen in pulses, and each pulse is like its own regular volcanic eruption. But because Yellowstone is a supervolcano, each pulse releases more ash and gases than a normal volcano. During the 1985 eruption, for example, an earthquake triggered a series of pulses that ejected 10 billion cubic feet of ash into the atmosphere in less than 2 days. That's the size of Mount St. Helens. And in total, the 1985 eruption ejected 40 billion cubic feet of ash, which covered much of the surrounding area in a layer of ash as much as 11 inches thick. Yellowstone's eruptions aren't known for being particularly explosive. Most of the ash comes from these little quakes, but don't think for a second that this is something to shrug off. Ash falling over a large area can harm both plants and animals. People who breathe it in can get lung damage, and it can wreak havoc on the local water supply. So while it's true that Yellowstone hasn't erupted in a way that would end all human civilization, that doesn't mean it isn't a threat. Earthquakes and volcanic winter could do serious damage to the surrounding area. And the worst part is, we might not be able to predict them. The biggest challenge for geologists trying to study Yellowstone is that it's mostly underwater. Over 50% of the magma chambers lie beneath the east basin of Yellowstone Lake, which means researchers can't drill down into the chambers to physically study them. And while scientists can use seismometers to detect earthquakes, it's hard to tell if they're detecting every rumble. Right now, there are 24 recording earthquakes near Yellowstone, but between 1985 and 1986, when there were almost 3,000 earthquakes, there were 80 seismometers monitoring the area. Now there are only 45. All this is to say that while we understand a lot about Yellowstone, the truth is we're still in the dark about a lot of things. And that includes knowing how likely earthquakes are to hit cities like Salt Lake City and Boise. It's not impossible, but it's also not very likely. But for Los Angeles, which is almost 800 miles away, scientists aren't sure. So if you live anywhere near Yellowstone National Park, or even a little farther away, there are some basic steps you can take to prepare for an earthquake. Make sure your emergency kit is stocked with food, water, and medicine. Secure heavy furniture to walls, and install a carbon monoxide detector. But even if you do all those things, it's still a good idea to check in with your local government to find out what resources they offer. Some counties near Yellowstone even have their own geological survey teams that monitor the volcano. They can keep you updated on anything weird that pops up, whether it's an earthquake or an angry bison. Yellowstone National Park is a beautiful place, but it's important to remember that it's home to forces that shaped our planet. So if you ever visit, please stay on the trails and leave the exploring to the bears. Thanks for watching this episode. We've made thousands of educational videos over the years, and we've been able to offer them for free because of our patrons. So to all of our patrons, thank you for what you do to make this happen. If you're not a patron, but you want to learn how you can help support the channel, you can go to our support page.